So, good morning, everyone. Last week's message by Simon saw that Jesus had come down from the Mount where he delivered his great and wonderful sermon. And today we discover that he was going home. Matthew 4:13 tells us he lived in Capernaum on the north shore of Galilee, a few miles south of where Jesus is thought to have delivered the Sermon on the Mount. Somewhere on his way home, he encountered the leper, you remember from last week, and the leper approached him, and he was the subject of what Simon spoke about. As he was entering Capernaum, we now read about one of at least 7 centurions mentioned in the New Testament. All of them seem to be honourable and respected men, even if they were part of the occupying and much despised Roman Gentile army. And so let's read from Matthew chapter 8, verse 5 to 13. When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came and pleaded with him, "Lord, my servant lies at home, paralyzed and in terrible agony." "I will go and heal him," Jesus replied. The centurion answered, "Lord, I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell one to go, and he goes, and another to come, and he comes. I tell my servant to do something, and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those following him, "Truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west to share the banquet with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into outer darkness, where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth." And Jesus said to the centurion, "Go, as you have believed, so it will be done for you." And his servant was healed at that very hour. Now, what is undoubtedly the same story is also recorded by Luke, and I will read that to you as well before we open up today's message. It's in chapter 7 of Luke, verses 1 to 10. When Jesus had concluded his discourse in the hearing of the people, he went to Capernaum, and there a highly valued servant of a centurion was sick and about to die. When the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders to ask him to come and heal his servant. They came to Jesus and pleaded with him earnestly, "This man is worthy to have you grant this, for he loves our nation and has built our synagogue." So Jesus went with them. But when they were not far from the house, the centurion sent friends with the message, "Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. That is why I did not consider myself worthy to come to you. But just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell one to go, and he goes, and another to come, and he comes. I tell my servant to do something, and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he marveled at the centurion. Turning to the crowd following him, he said, "I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such great faith." And when the messengers returned to the house, they found the servant in good health. So just briefly, and before we look at the message in these accounts, it doesn't take much to see that at first reading there are some logical contradictions in the two accounts. Matthew has the centurion himself come to Jesus. Luke has the centurion send first some Jews and then some friends to speak to him. He doesn't speak to him himself. So which was it? Did the centurion come himself, or did he send others? If you take a narrow view, one account at least must surely be wrong. Matthew is more likely to have been an eyewitness to this event, but Luke's first verses of his gospel says that he made very careful examination of eyewitness accounts. I'm not going to spend much time at the beginning on this, but I shouldn't ignore it either. It comes up, and the Bible has a number of verses here and there where similar questions arise. But in order to confirm the perfect intent of God's inspired words in the Bible, we need to remember also the complexities of human character and culture. If I, for instance, I might say to you that I gave my uncle a pair of socks for Christmas. My aunt, describing exactly the same thing, might say that the postman, or perhaps Father Christmas, brought uncle a pair of socks. My communication may have no interest in mentioning the intermediary postman or Father Christmas, but my aunt speaks differently from her perspective. And we all understand that there's not necessarily a logical contradiction. So Matthew is known for abbreviating some of his stories, and Luke is known for being more forensic in his detail. Matthew was a Jew, and Luke almost certainly was a Gentile. And so it's perfectly possible that Matthew left out the intermediary messengers from his account in order to emphasize that Jesus, a Jew, was very willing to interact directly with a Gentile. On the other hand, Luke, a Gentile, may have included the centurion's Jewish intermediaries in order to show that the centurion, a Gentile, was very respectful about approaching Rabbi Jesus, a Jew. We can read commentaries about these two differing accounts, and in the end, we don't really know why the accounts are different. But rather than diminish the authenticity of the Bible, for me, this only serves to add marvel to the perfect intent of God alongside his partnership with imperfect man. And anyway, both passages communicate the same essential information. There's also another little bit of background before we continue. In the accounts of encountering the leper and the centurion, Matthew describes Jesus arriving at Peter's house and healing his mother-in-law later. And then on the evening of the same day, in verse 16, it says, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with a word and healed all the sick. Jesus must have had what was an extraordinarily busy and tiring day. He delivered his Sermon on the Mount, he healed the leper, he then healed the centurion's servant, he then went to Peter's mother-in-law and healed her, and then many came for deliverance and healing right into the evening. Luke's account omits the healing of the leper, but includes another healing later in a nearby town, Nain. But Matthew specifically chooses the sequences that we're now reading. First the leper, and then the centurion. We saw last week that the leper's suffering was extreme in so many different ways, physically through the effect of the disease, terrible disease, and emotionally through rejection, undoubtedly, socially as an unclean outcast. And now we encounter a different kind of extremity, but one which was also extremely severe. The centurion's servant was paralyzed and in what is described as terrible suffering. When I was 27 years old, I was in the Royal Free Hospital for a couple of weeks, and when I'd recovered sufficiently to be free of drips and able to walk beyond my bed, I asked about the noise that I'd been hearing every day. It was an unearthly, muffled, moaning sound, like an animal trapped somewhere in a distant wood. And the nurses just said, oh, that's Julie. She's had a stroke. And I wandered about the wing and eventually traced the noise to a private room. I shouldn't have done. I quietly opened the door and I went in. The television had been left on permanently every day, and there in the bed was a young woman, very thin beneath the sheets as far as I could see, and she was awake. Julie had had a stroke and was completely paralyzed, but conscious. I was a very new Christian. I had no idea what to say or do in those circumstances, but I asked her to blink once if she could understand me, and straight away she blinked. I sensed such a compassion from Jesus about her appalling psychological and physical situation, but I was also very unsure of myself. I simply said to her several times that Jesus knows and he cares. I do wish that I'd done more, but I didn't, and I then left the room. And later in that day, the nurses were all chattering, I overheard them, and commenting that Julie had stopped screaming for the first time in weeks. And so she had, and she never screamed again while I was there. I'll only know in heaven what actually happened. My mother also was paralyzed by stroke for 3 months before she died, but she was conscious. She too suffered great mental anguish as well as physical pain from cramps, which can still occur if you're paralyzed. And physically, you can do nothing with your body to try and find any relief. Matthew records the centurion's servant as being paralyzed and in terrible suffering. Luke records him as being sick and about to die. The centurion in those days had a right to kill his servant when he could no longer work for him. There was no P60 to issue. There was no hospital. There was no state-run nursing home to look after him. The agony of his paralysis had life and death implications for the servant and for the centurion, and I have no doubt that it was as distressing and compassion-wrenching as my own experiences with Julie, my mother. And so I think that the two questions that Matthew poses with his deliberate inclusion of the account, first of the leper and now the centurion and his servant, are the two great questions that commonly arise when it comes to God's providential care of humanity in the midst of suffering. The first question is God willing to touch what is unclean, represented by the leper, the one who is oh so unworthy of even being brought near to Jesus, and whose sickness often represents in the Bible that of our own, the appalling and unclean nature of our sin before a holy God. And secondly, if God is willing, is he able to heal? These are the two great accusatory questions which are so often levied against God. If you, God, are supposed to be all compassionate, why do you not seem willing to end the world of suffering? And if you are all powerful, why do you not seem able to intervene? You, God, are either willing but unable, or you are able but unwilling, or perhaps even both, unwilling and unable. These are very much the thoughts of those who do not know God and his ways, and sometimes they're also the thoughts of those who do know him. We saw last week that the leper, the one who was unworthy of even drawing near to Jesus, came and cast himself right at Jesus' feet. In contrast, the one who the centurion's Jewish friends say is worthy of Jesus' help refuses to present himself in that way. Lord, I'm not worthy to have you enter my house. Can it be then that Matthew has simply thought to himself, those two or three miracles of the day will do for my account? Or has he, as I'm sure you'll agree, chosen these two miracles very carefully? The leper and the centurion surely represent two great themes. The one being God's proximate and compassionate willingness to enter and draw near into our world, and the other is his distant, all-powerful rule and reign. These miracles, I think, represent his eager willingness to be present in our contaminated world and his powerful ability to intervene, though he is distant and unseen on his heavenly throne. The nature and character of God, reflected in these two themes, runs through the Old and the New Testament. And I think that those themes are to do with the nature of priesthood and of kingship. The priest represents man to God, and the king represents God to man. Jesus is both our great high priest, representing and interceding for us between man and God. And we might know that Jesus tells the leper to give thanks to God through priestly intervention. And Jesus is also our high King of heaven, representing all the authority of God to man, which is something that the centurion clearly recognizes. As our great high priest, Jesus was fully qualified to intercede for man on earth. And as our king, he is given all of heaven's authority by God. I think that is reflected by Jesus' words to his disciples when he told them later in chapter 8 of this gospel that all authority on earth and in heaven has been given to me. These are some words, some of his last words recorded in Matthew's gospel. As our high priest, Jesus is fully made like us, tempted and tested in every single way, exactly as we are, yet without sin, able to sympathize and to suffer with us, which that word means to suffer with, sympathize, that's what it means. And so he's able to fully identify with us. Hebrews 4 verses 14 to 16 say, therefore, since we have a great high priest who has gone through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet without sin. Let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in our time of need. The leper knew that even in his uncleanness, his very nature of being a repulsive outcast, he knew that there was one to whom he could draw near, who would accept his plea. And indeed that nearness even extended to the Lord's outstretched touch. The centurion, an honorable and honored man in his community, so completely different from the leper, nonetheless deemed himself unworthy to draw near. Yet he knew that he could call on Jesus' kingly authority from a distance. Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof. That is why I didn't consider myself worthy to come to you. But just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell one to go, and he goes, and another to come, and he comes. I tell my servant to do something, and he does it. There are some further parallels and differences in these two wonderful accounts of healings. Both the leper and the centurion present strong and passionate pleas to Jesus. It must have been obvious from the very proximity of the leper that he was presenting his own desperate need. The centurion, however, presented the desperate need of someone else. Lord, my servant is in terrible suffering. It's the Lord's very nature that he cannot help but respond to these pleas of suffering, whether it's from his children for themselves or for those who intercede for another. And he seems to do so in these two stories when passion is willing to break down the Lord's door to get his attention, rather than to perhaps gently knock with the worry that he or the neighbors might be a bit disturbed by us. Both the leper and the centurion believed wrongly that they really shouldn't bother Jesus. Yet they are like the parable of the importune neighbor, where Jesus says in Luke 11 verse 8, yet because of your shameless audacity, he will surely get up and give you as much as you need. There was great audacity from both the leper, who shouldn't have come anywhere near Jesus because of his uncleanness, and also the centurion, who likewise, as a Gentile, had no business bothering a rabbi with his Gentile uncleanness. And yet both came to him passionately to present the extremity of their circumstances, and not with hesitant and politely diffident requests. Spurgeon says this about the centurion. He says, he seeks a cure, but does not prescribe to the Lord how or where he shall work it. In fact, he does not put his request into words, but pleads the case and lets the sorrow speak. Julie's sorrow in that hospital bed surely spoke to the Lord, and I believe he came to touch her through one of his servants. And so Jesus says to the centurion or to his messengers, when he heard of the distress of the servant and of the centurion in the household distress, he says, I will come and heal him. It was completely against Jewish custom for a Jew to enter a Gentile's house, though not against God's law, but Jesus didn't hesitate to go. Most Jews believed that a Gentile home was not worthy of them, and the centurion supposed that a great rabbi and teacher like Jesus would consider his home unworthy. Neither the leper nor the centurion really knew the willing nature and character of Jesus, that he is more than willing to enter our unclean world. That was the reason he came, to save sinners and present them cleansed before God. And it's not the kind of willingness which says, I suppose I must then. It's never expressed as, I have a duty to perform, or, well, this is my commission, so I guess you better lead the way. No, Jesus has the deepest of desires to be drawn in this world to the humbly ignorant, to the wayward sinner, to those who suffer and who mourn. He's undoubtedly was going to go straight to the centurion's house and to enter straight in. The bowels of his compassion could not but do otherwise. Nonetheless, the centurion says, "No, Lord, don't come in. I'm not worthy." Respectfully, the centurion recognized that the Lord's priestly compassion to enter the gap between heaven and earth did not need Jesus' proximity. The centurion knew that Jesus also had kingly authority, the authority to command from a distance. "But only speak one word, and my servant will be healed." The centurion fully understood that Jesus' healing power was not some sort of magic trick that required a magician's presence. It was not a blessed handkerchief or healing hands that needed to be laid on. It was just the speaking of a word, even one word. The centurion knew that Jesus had true authority and could command things to be done and completed outside of his immediate presence. This centurion showed great faith in Jesus' word. He understood that Jesus can heal with his word just as easily as with a touch to a leper. That same word which the centurion asked for had the power to still the storm on Galilee just a few verses later on in Matthew, and also to create the very heavens and the earth in the first chapters of Genesis. The centurion understood both the power of Jesus' words, that it would heal, and that Jesus himself was under the authority of God and would therefore fully wield God's authority. He understood that what the king commanded through his servants was the same as what the king commanded himself. "But just say the word, and my servant will be healed, for I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell one to go, and he goes, another to come, and he comes. I tell my servant to do something, and he does it." As the authority of the Caesars flowed through the centurion's own yielded life, so the authority of God over diseases, demons, and all else flowed through Christ's yielded life. And one of the most challenging matters of faith, I think, and one which Jesus marveled at here in the centurion's understanding of who Jesus was, is that the kingly authority flowing through Jesus also flows through his yielded servants. We too are under authority, if indeed we are yielded to the King. We too are not just a priesthood interceding for and touching the world, but we are a royal priesthood exercising the King's command. "All authority in heaven and on earth is given to me," Jesus said in Matthew 28:18. "Therefore go, you go, and make disciples." Jesus has delegated his authority to us to teach and to do all things that he did, and to make other disciples to do the same. The centurion's understanding of Jesus' kingly authority made Jesus marvel about his faith to the extent of honoring him before the others gathered on that day. Here was a Gentile who understood more about faith than the sons of the kingdom, the Jews. And so Jesus said, "Truly, I tell you, I've not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west to share the banquet with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. By grace, you and I have come from the east and from the west, and we will share in the great banquet. Yet the sons of the kingdom, the Jews to whom Jesus came, who presumed that their national status was enough to draw them near, that their religious observance placed them in the front seat, so to speak. But they did not see that Jesus responds to those who are meek and lowly of heart, like Jesus himself. Those presumptuous sons of the kingdom, Jesus said, would go to outer darkness. But in the centurion's humility and in his desperation, Jesus said to him, "Go, it will be done just as you believed it would." Is that what Jesus would say to us this morning? Go, it will be done to you just as you believed it would. I pray that we would catch hold of some of the centurion's faith. Shall we pray? Father, as we are yielded to you through Jesus Christ, as we understand that you have given us unbelievable privilege, both as priests and as people who can administer your authority on earth, I pray, Lord, that we would catch hold of that faith, which helps us to realize that we have the command of the King behind us and through us, and that we would be able to extend your kingdom with the authority that by grace you've granted us. So, Lord, together we ask, Lord, increase our faith that we too might see the demons leave, and those with leprosy, and those that are paralyzed, and those that are suffering, that we might see them healed as your kingship rules and reigns in us. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.